everybody. Welcome to the Tortoise newsroom. My name is Liz Mosley. I'm an editor here. And good evening to everybody who's watching at home. We're going to have a conversation that's quite difficult this evening. I feel like I've already had quite a long day, but this is the sort of main event, really, in that the conversation we're having this evening, I think, is going to be rather different than I thought it was when we conceived of the idea for this thinking. Originally, we sort of talked about what we've called the hardest word, what are we prepared to forgive? And I imagined us talking about things like cricketers and social media influencers making awkward, unfortunate, racist or otherwise unwise missteps on social media several years ago and what happened to their careers as a consequence. Maybe we'll touch on that, I don't know. But we've already talked a lot about what is commonly known these days as cancel culture. And I actually think there is something much more important to be said about the changing nature of what we might call public accountability. What are the standards of behaviour, of performance, of delivery that we expect of people in positions of responsibility, whether in commercial organisations or government organisations or NGOs or whatever. And also in that question, what are we prepared to forgive? Who is we? And why would we have any say in the matter anyway? I really want to try and get under the skin of how this kind of stuff is mediated when things go wrong, and in some cases terribly wrong. What happens then? And for whose benefit is that process of retribution and ultimately redemption? Are the rules applied the same to everybody? Does everybody have equal access to those things? I want to try and stretch ourselves to see what lessons we can learn, principally by looking at a story that many people will remember. Some people might be too young to have been sort of fully cognizant of it happening at the time. And a whole series of actors, individuals and institutional and sort of cultural and ephemeral and political, certainly, that fed into what was an incredibly traumatic time for certainly Sharon Shoesmith, who's sitting here, and sort of in a weird way for the nation, whatever that might mean. That was certainly some of the language that was being used at the time. What I'm talking about is the death of Peter Connolly. He was a little boy who was killed at the hands of his mother, her boyfriend, and his brother in 2007. And we want to use that as a way into thinking about these questions of forgiveness and accountability and to see what we can learn about what's happening in other institutions now, perhaps the current government, perhaps the Met Police and other police forces, and just to see where we get to. Because we mean it when we say it's thinking, we want to hear what you think and not just what we all think. I'm going to start by, we're going to try, stand by for technology, a brief poll, and always with a poll question, it's necessarily reductive, so just go with it to kind of get the thing going. And I would really like to know, and you can join in at home if you want to, in the room if you just stick your hand in the air. In general, over the last decade, what are we now, 2021, so go back about 10 years or so. I know some of you would have been very young 10 years ago. I was still old. Do you think British society in general has become more or less forgiving of people in positions of responsibility? So if you're in a position of responsibility, something goes wrong, do you think now, let's say hand up in the room, if you think now we are less forgiving of people in positions of responsibility? Okay, hands right up in the air. Oh, I think that probably is there or thereabouts a majority. What about people online? I don't know if I can see the results of the poll. Let's pick about who put their hand up. Seb, why?
I mean, just given the whole cancel culture thing and the increasing scrutiny online, especially in Twitter. I've only recently gotten a Twitter account since I've started working here, and I've always avoided it as best I can because it seems really horrible and toxic, and it really is. It is absolute, and just people aren't there to support each other. When they shout out something they've seen that's negative, it's just to get likes and to get credit for it. Like, they don't actually, like, I don't know. And just that speaks to what I imagine is a changing general attitude and just increasing scrutiny of people. Like, there's more platforms to talk about how terrible things are. So,
So there's an element of performativity you've talked about there, a sort of, we sometimes call it virtue signaling, or a deflection of outrage sometimes. Sure. I'm so angry about this in order that these things are less noticeable about my other terrible behaviours, perhaps. Just
for attention. And
stuff. I mean, interesting. Who didn't put their hand up? Who thinks the opposite? Gabby, what tell me why?
Thank you. So I think in some respects I agree with what Seb is saying, but equally it feels that we turn a blind eye to what a lot of our politicians are doing that we might think is unforgivable. So I think on one side there is a big element of the social media backlash to things, but equally there are a lot of people in positions of power that we seem to sort of let their mistakes and faux pas kind of slide.
Some people seem more able to be forgiven than others. I'm interested that the poll results for the people watching from home, 67% said less, so in agreement more with Seb. Sharon, what do you think, broadly speaking? You obviously will talk about your experience in 2008 in a second. Do you think now less forgiving? I mean, it was pretty bad then, by your experience.
Well, overall, I think it becomes party political, and it just depends on what some of the conditions are at the point in time that it occurs, whatever it is that occurs. I know we'll probably say something about Cressida Dick, but going back to the case that I was part of, the brutal murder of a child, of a baby, is the worst that it gets. There is nothing worse. The murder of Sarah, just lost her last name. Everard.
Yeah.
Isn't even as bad as that, even though it's so bad, even though it has churned us up desperately. But the brutal murder of a baby has a different ring to it entirely. It is very, very hard to believe it. And at that time, and Patrick will remember some of this, you know, the public were told, this baby has died in Haringey, where a previous child also died, Victoria Kalimbe. What they didn't tell the public was that 416 children were also subject to familial homicide around the country. They were killed by a known adult in that time, 416. But yet the public were told, this is the director who is presided over this service where 2 children have been murdered. She needs wiped out. Yeah. Now, if you were sitting in your house hearing all of this, you would have said, yeah, let's get rid of her straight away. And this was the message that was going out. But the thing that triggered it to begin with, because Ed Balls' department, the Labour government, knew all about the death of Peter Connolly. I was going and speaking to his senior civil servants throughout the time, for the 16 months between Peter dying and the public becoming aware of it. So they knew all about it. But at that point in time, we were just sort of trying to tease out what was happening at that point in time. David Cameron was desperate to be Prime Minister. He's an opportunist in my mind. He was desperate to be Prime Minister. And he was going to stop at nothing to be Prime Minister. He was courting the Murdoch empire. He was wanting to get the son behind him, and indeed he did before the election 2010. He had an old friend in Rebecca Brooks. He had a good friend in her ex-lover. And together, I think they cooked this up, that when this story hits, and they would have known about Peter's death, we're going to hit Labour with it. Yeah. What they did alongside hitting Labour with it was bring my career to an end. I'd been 35 years working for children. Bring my career to an end, but actually enable social workers to be so shocked at what had happened that they brought thousands of children into the care system who would never have been there. Now, you can argue maybe some of them should have been. You could argue that maybe Peter should have been, but that's what they did. They brought a large number of children into the care system. And we now have, I think we're heading up to about 80,000. Are you anywhere near knowing this?
80,000.
It is 80,000.
We're in the.
Yeah.
We're in care last year.
Yeah.
2020.
Yeah.
In 2008, it was probably 56,000.
Right. It was just
Not
it was
sure,
just
not
it was
far
under
off
the
double.
50. It was under
Yeah.
the 50 when Peter died. It was just under 50.
Yeah.
So my point is, it depends what the issue is, the party politics, yeah, the newspapers, how the media and the politicians then work together. Now, can I just say, compare the Cressida Dick situation
Sure,
now?
please
Would that
do,
be
yeah.
okay? You look at Cressida Dick, she was never going to be sacked by the Prime Minister. It wasn't going to happen. She's an appointee. Yeah, she's been working in the Foreign Office. She has a background in Uxbridge. She wasn't going to be sacked. It was the wrong time to sack her when the issue was misogyny in the police. You're not going to sack your first female head of the Met, are you? It wasn't going to happen. But the party politics bubbled up. You know, Labour were out there making comment about her having to be sacked. Within 36 hours, Boris Johnson waited that 36 hours. I was watching this so carefully, hour by hour, where is this going, where is this going? And he backed her. And she was home and dry because the media backed off. They weren't going to take it on, and she's safe. But what I would suggest is she will be on her way in not too long from now, and she'll probably go on her way maybe to the Lords or into a job within government. Yeah. And she'll be lauded and she'll be celebrated in her career. She wasn't going to lose her career. So the whole thing of public accountability to me is not a thing that can be defined and applied. Yeah, it depends on the circumstances at that moment in time.
Sharon, I'm going to ask you sort of a slightly more personal perspective. I want to come to Patrick in a second, and we'll talk about some of the specifics of the context and the this sort of notion of almost preparing the ground for whose fault it is in the event that something would go wrong. But for your part, people in the chat are talking about there's more outrage now, but I'm not sure about forgiveness. And it feels like we live in quite an angry time. And Seb's mentioned social media and toxicity, and that's been spoken about ad infinitum. I think it's quite easy to forget that there's a person in the story. And that's why I think a lot about Cressida Dick. She's a person.
Yes.
In that maelstrom.
Yes.
For any whatever else, she's a person. In your case, when the media frenzy really kicked in, when the death of Peter Connolly became public knowledge, which was quite a long time after he'd actually died, because there'd been an inquest and what have you, the trial.
There hadn't been an inquest, and I'll come back to that
Not
point.
yet, sorry, there'd been the trial. It was the sentencing, wasn't it, of
Yes.
And I wonder how you felt, and I wonder if, obviously with hindsight, and I've read your book, which is, it says on the front, a forensic account of a modern day political witch hunt, which is quite Patrick. I wonder if you could see what was happening, obviously not to the extent that you can now, but did you have a sense of what was happening really? Or were you just so caught up in the, oh my goodness, how quickly did it take for you to sort of start to pull at those threads and understand the different dynamics between what was going on?
It took a long time for me to understand is a very important word. I think, forgiveness has to have understanding sitting underneath it somewhere or above it or somewhere, to feed into it. No, I was shocked. I was utterly shocked at what happened. And I was having some continuing dialogue with some of the civil servants in Ed Bowles' office, who were saying, when all this dies down, come in and see us. They weren't expecting all this to happen either. So I was quite shocked. But it's interesting because earlier you were saying, how did it feel for me? But I started off being quite strong and quite together, actually. Now, when Ed Bowles had his famous press conference, I mean, I'll look back on that now, and it was just
when he sacked you on telly, basically.
on TV. I mean, it was a huge act of abuse of power, really. You know, on he came and sacks this person, you know, on live TV, and I was watching it and like, what? You know, I mean, I probably didn't recover for about 2 days. I couldn't move or speak. But then all the stuff that poured out, what I was thinking, no, that's not true. And there's facts around that. You know, people know, lots of people know that's not true. And people know where the evidence is for that. And all these things were pouring. I was saying, no, that's not the case at all. And all the time, for quite a few weeks, I thought, somebody's going to stand up and tell the truth here.
Yeah.
Someone's going to do that.
Yeah.
And I kind of expected that to happen for some time.
And they didn't.
And it didn't happen. But you see, you know, anybody who was prepared to stand up then and defend what was going on was going to be tantamount to sort of supporting this brutal murder of this child. I mean, and I go back to that, the act, that we're, you know, the incident we're talking about. Nobody was going to stand up and be the person who said, well, hang on, everybody.
Yeah.
And when Ed Balls walked onto that stage and sat down, I thought he was going to calm things. I thought he was going to actually steady what was going on. That's how far away I was.
Right. Interesting.
From anything that happened next.
Patrick, let's talk about the role of the media. Patrick Butler is social policy editor of The Guardian, and you covered this story, and you knew Sharon and everything that happened afterwards, which took years to go through. And we were just chatting downstairs, and you sort of mentioned there was a little bit of a sense of why we're still talking about this after the fact. You know, we've done that. We know what happened. You know, Sharon Shoesmith's gone. You know, it was her what did it, and then don't kind of move on. But you kept on pushing. Why?
I think it was because I came to this story first as a reader. So at the time, when this had gone through the courts, it was the crime correspondent had reported on it. Then it became a kind of a political story in the November of that year. So the lobby were covering this, and then we did the story of the sacking, which was this great moment of shock and awe, where Ed Balls gets up and sacks Sharon live on TV. And it was in some ways impressive, but I was also thinking, well, there must be something really, really bad going on here. And it's after that when I read the Ofsted report, which was compiled, which was basically gave Ed Balls the ammunition to sack Sharon. And I read this and I kept waiting for the smoking gun to come. I kept waiting for the line that was going to say Sharon Shoesmith was guilty of neglect here. And it didn't happen. And I thought, well, that was a bit of an underwhelming report. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought that this was a kind of performative act that actually bore little relation to the reality. And then there wasn't much cause to do much about it, because at that point, the narrative had been established so strongly in the media, and basically most of the media signed up to the idea, which was, you know, popularly published by The Sun, but it was basically across the board that it was Sharon's fault, it was the social workers' fault, and they should suffer for this. And that's when I got interested in what the truth was. And that's when I first met Sharon for a cup of tea in Bloomsbury. And over the next few weeks, we had umpteen cups of tea where I talked to Sharon about what happened. And we went through it again and again and again, because essentially I couldn't believe what Sharon was telling me. I thought, well, you know, of course she would say that. Show me the evidence. And so eventually I started to get bits of evidence. And what essentially I saw happening was in some ways a grave injustice, really. And that's when I went to the Guardian. I went back to the Guardian and said, look, I think there's something here. And even then, although the Guardian was very supportive, the onus was on me to say, well, what, you're telling me that the story of Baby P isn't what was published? And so it was always a sense of having to overcome the rigidly established narrative about what happened and who was responsible. And in a way, that wasn't really unpicked for, well, it was 2 years until another 2 years of court battle. And then, even then, you know, even now, we're probably trying to re-establish.
I was going to say, even in spite of all your unpicking, and in spite of your winning of the appeal, and in spite of Leveson and everything we know now that we didn't know then, I still feel like if you were to stop somebody walking past and ask them what happened with Baby P, it would be the original narrative that you would be more likely to hear than the one that we now know. Because the one we now know is a lot more complicated, unfortunately, kind of hard to get people to buy into.
Yeah. I get worried sometimes somebody in the public is going to mistake me, Sharon, for Tracy, the mother, who was involved in the death. We don't know if she killed him. And I'll get attacked by someone. But I mean, you're saying about the story, you know, it unfolded and unfolded. And I think a very important part of the story, which I do want to say something about tonight, is, you know, when you're working in child protection services, you're the social services. I mean, I had a 1,300 staff, and over a £200 million budget. This was a big service of social workers and education. But you're working alongside the police and you're working alongside health. And the organisations we were working with were the Met and Great Ormond Street. And Great Ormond Street had recently developed their work into the community because it was part of getting trust status. Some of these things maybe don't mean too much to the audience, but this was a very important period. And what we found, and what I knew in the investigation we did, was that there were, mistakes on the behalf of the social workers, but of in a minor way, not making their notes on time, not uploading them on time, etc. And when I went and spoke to the media at the beginning and said there was no evidence to suggest that they should be sacked, and their own organisation, 2-3 years down the line, came to the same conclusion. But just park that for a minute. So you had the police and you had Great Ormond Street. Now, the police had got themselves into a very difficult position over the Baby P case. They had arrested the mother twice because we had raised issues. They forgot to allocate the case for a period of 4 months. And we're talking here about over a year of investigation. So this is a significant amount of time. They were so out of time that they met the mother the day before Peter was killed to tell her they had no case against her. And our social worker was in the room. Now, that social worker had been waiting for a period of time for evidence from the police to tell her, are we nailing this mother? Are we trying to take this child into care? She'd already been to the solicitors, our own lawyers, to say we need to look at a care proceeding for these children. That lawyer wanted them to wait until the police had produced their findings. She also wanted them to wait until the child had gone to an appointment with Great Ormond Street. Great Ormond Street had taken over 4 months to produce an appointment, which had been chased and chased and chased. So Peter was seen 2 days before. So on Wednesday, he's seen by a paediatrician who we later learn should never have been there because she wasn't properly qualified to be there. She was a locum and she was standing in. Her career was trashed and she as a person was trashed in a dreadful racist way, you may recall. And she disappeared off the scene in a very bad state. So that's Wednesday. Police tell the parents, the mother, there's no case to answer, and he's dead on Friday morning. Now, what we then experience is the police in turmoil. They're scaring us off during the inquiry into it. They are blaming us. They are coming up with all sorts of false evidence. And this goes on and on and on. And there's no one who would have been more upset when this hit the politics, the party politics, than the police. Yeah. And what they did was go into overdrive in briefing the Sun with a lot of false information as to what has gone on with social workers. It was horrendous, the stuff that was being briefed to the Sun. And of course, they had a petition which they claimed had 1 million signatures to get rid of me and the social workers. And this went on, but the case of the police never really came to public attention. It never really was heard, nor was Great Ormond Street, because the politicians aren't going to touch those two. If you've got an ex-Looney left council in Haringey, and you've got Gosh, and you've got the Met, who are you going to go for? Whose throat are you going for? Yeah. Which is the Labour Council.
The weakest of the three.
So that's where it went.
Yeah.
And this story went, dropped down, and we didn't hear about it. But what went on was I was being absolutely under siege by the press in my flat, which wasn't terribly far from here, and really under siege, stuck in my flat for days at a time. And then I was getting death threats. And the police would move in and take this material away that had arrived, take it away and forensically examine it and so on. They'd have their people come in to screw down my windows, put boxes on the back of the door to catch a fire, show me a space in my flat which I could run to if there's a mob outside, advising me not to run out. In other words, they scared the hell out of me. My daughter was there, they sent her off. Yeah. And I look back on that and realize I was being scared of. And I am of the view that the death threats came from the police. That's what I believe now. That's where they came from, to scare me off. Their timing is also very interesting. And then we roll on a little bit and they make a huge play that we don't need an inquest. So they submit 43 documents to the pre-inquest hearing. And in there are no reports of their own. So I have, and one of them came through my letterbox, 3 reports that were done internally in the police, heavily criticising their handling of the case. And of the 43 documents that went for the pre-inquest hearing, they weren't among it. Yeah. Now, as of now, we don't know where Peter was murdered or killed, who killed him. We know nothing about what actually happened. And in that court hearing, 3 of them were charged with causing and allowing. No one was ever charged with his murder as such. And he's never had an inquest. And I, to this day, feel that there was an awful scramble around the police to try and cover their tracks. And I'm going to be a bit braver and say another couple of sentences.
Go on. Yep.
I don't go into blame, even though it sounds like it, because I can understand why they might want to have covered this up to such a degree because of what was coming at them, yeah, which is what was coming at me. Yeah, they avoided that. And I do believe to this day that one part of the police, of the Met Police, knew about the men who were in Peter Connolly's house. We didn't know that another bloke and his family had moved in to the home. I believe that one branch knew about it, but never told the KATE, and the KATE's the Child Abuse Investigation Team, which is mainly women. All right, add it to what you know, mainly women, and the 2 did not communicate. And where you see that problem occurring before, and I think this is possibly why the police were so motivated to do something about it, is in Soham, which again is probably before the time of many of you when the 2 little girls were murdered by the school caretaker. And what emerged was that one part of the police knew and they didn't tell the other branch who were in touch and could have. And I think the same things happened here. And there was a famous report, not a famous, but an important report called the Bishard Report, which laid this out about the tragedy of that, of this lack of communication. And I believe that that's another complex part of the story that has never really been told.
Sharon, thank you for that. I'm just taking some of that in. I'd like to bring in a couple of people from the chat. I'd be interested to hear from Sharon Evans, who is watching. She is a social worker, and I'd really like to hear after Sharon from Ray Jones, who we've invited on this evening, who is a emeritus professor of social work and has done also written a book all about the story of Baby P. But if we can go to Sharon first, because I'm interested, Sharon, in real world consequences of the response to the death of Peter Connolly. We've heard from Sharon, and we saw in the charts, the huge increase in numbers of children going into care. But you are a social worker, and you've said in the chat that you feel that Baby P, the whole sort of feeling of the aura, if you like, of what happened with Baby P and Sharon and everything else, still affects the status of your profession today.
Yeah, well, I think, just the way that the social workers are talked about in the press. When anything goes wrong, social workers are blamed instantly. And I really agree with what Sharon said about how the press went for her rather than those other two institutions, because all social workers know it's never straightforward. There's always a complex story. And you instead of trying to find out what went wrong in a way that would have perhaps protected children in the future, it just made it harder and harder to be a social worker. It made it harder to retain experienced social workers in child protection. You just never ever told anybody that you were a social worker. And one day I forgot to take my badge off when I went out for lunch, and I was in a shop looking for a birthday card, and this group of people just rounded on me and started asking me about something that had happened in the press. Social workers were being reported again, saying, what do you know about it? What do you think about it? And I thought, well, why are they talking to me? And then I looked down with absolute horror that I'd got my badge on that said social worker on it. And I just thought, I can't go on like this, because, I'm proud of what I do. We help families, and I just shouted back saying, what do you expect to happen in society? Do you think that we just allow families, we allow children to remain unprotected, and we work in partnership with families? We don't, we're a damned if we do and damned if we don't. If we remove children, we're told that we're interfering in family life, and we shouldn't be doing that. So I joined the campaign for social work, Stand Up for Social Work. And I still, to this day, I tell people I'm a social worker, and you either get the head to one side going, oh, that must be really rewarding, or nothing. But I just, there's lots of different types of social work, and I'm not a child protection social worker anymore, but I think about my colleagues every day. There'll be a lot of social workers now, it's 7:06, who will still be in the office trying to get on top of their notes.
Yeah.
So that they can go home and feel that they can sleep tonight, because and wait till tomorrow. And I feel for those social workers.
Sharon, thank you very much, and thank you for being a social worker, and thank you for coming on and talking about it. Let's talk to Ray Jones, who is a sort of academic analyst of social work and has looked into what happened with Baby P a lot. I was saying to Sharon downstairs, Ray, thank you for being here, by the way, that she makes a very cogent argument. And I think actually what Sharon was talking about speaks to this. Is I think it's a reality. I don't think it's social workers imagining it, which is that so we have to believe, the public, I suppose I'm saying, we have to believe that social workers can stop the worst thing from happening. We're very invested in that idea that these are the people who are there to stop it from happening. And then when the worst thing does happen, because of course you can't always stop it, no amount of social work could always stop it, it's really hard for me to sort of believe that. Even now, even knowing it's impossible to stop it, I still want them to stop it. Was it inevitable that Sharon or somebody equivalent to Sharon would just get the blame for what happened to Peter Connolly, do you think? And is it still the same?
Well, it wasn't inevitable, and Sharon has been telling the story, and as Patrick has been saying as well, this was a story that was concocted between the police, the press, and politicians. There are about 50 to 70 children who are known to die in England each year as a consequence of abuse and neglect. And only so often does that attract anything more than maybe a little bit of local media or regional television attention. And in this instance, it was a story that was created, as I say, for, or as Sharon was indicating, for reasons that may have suited the police, may have suited politicians, and certainly suited at that point in time the Sun newspaper and Rebecca Brooks. The big story at this time, November 2008, was about the banking crash created by crazy banking policies and practices. But that was turned around to a story about baby P in the Sun day after day after day. And let's face it, and there is some craziness here. If someone dies in hospital, we don't have to blame a doctor, do we? If someone creates a criminal offence, we don't have to blame a police officer. If someone fails an exam, we don't have to blame a teacher. But it looks as though, in terms of the terrible and awful neglect and abuse of children, if children are abused or neglected, there must be somebody out there to blame beyond the abusers. And often that lands on the social workers.
Ray, do you think that the damage, if you like, that was wrought on the social work profession, I can see Emma Jackson asking questions in the chat, whether parents have become more afraid of engaging with social workers, whether the building of trust in that sort of working relationship has been made more difficult because of what happened with Peter Connolly and all of the fallout from that?
Well, Liz, you introduced me as an academic. I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for over 50 years. And I was a social services director for 14 years as well, from 1992 to 2006. And more recently, the government had parachuted me into areas of the country where often it said children's services weren't doing very well, to give some advice and, to be honest, to promote some action sometimes that needed to be taken. But what's happened recently as a consequence, and I say not recently, actually it was a knee-jerk reaction in November 2008 because of the intensity of the media coverage and the way it was targeting, vilifying social workers. Local authorities across the country all of a sudden initiated more care proceedings. It's a defensive practice. If we're concerned about a child, let's get the case in court. That jumped up very quickly. There's been a 125% increase since 2009, just after the story broke in the media, in child protection investigations. We now have a system which is both overloaded. We have a system which has become skewed away from being and do what we want to do, which is to help families, to investigating families. We've become focused on risk assessment and risk management rather than being beside people who are in increasing difficulty as a consequence, for example, of increasing poverty, to be beside them to help them see a way through with the stresses and strains in their lives. And actually, we go back to 2008, and who was the politician who was generating this story alongside Rebecca Brooks and the Sun with ammunition from the police? It was David Cameron. And yet from 2010 to 2016, it was David Cameron who's decimated, I have to say, and it's still happening today, those public services that would be there to protect children and also to help families. And we have got ourselves in a position now where we are now really crumbling, I have to say, right across the country, and being able to do the jobs that we should be able to do to help families. And we become skewed in our focus in terms of looking at risk management.
Thank you, Ray. I'd love to bring in Lucy Butler if we can. I don't know if she's. I know she's on an iPhone, so I'm not sure if it'll work. But Lucy in the chat, I think you are currently a director of children's services. Is that right, Lucy?
I am. Yeah, I work in West Sussex.
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thanks so much for sparing the time. I'm sure you're insanely busy. You're right. You're doing this now. Just
I am right now.
Back to us what some of the things that you think we can and should be learning from this in terms of, I guess, trust, blame, accountability, all of this stuff. How does it feel to you?
I mean, I think child protection is one of the most complex jobs that you can do. And I think it's so easy for people to blame us for getting it wrong. But actually, it's really, really complex and it's a really hard job. And I know lots of directors, not just Sharon. I mean, she's probably one of the most kind of public that that lose their jobs when, say, Ofsted come in. We're with one of the most highly regulated professions, and directors often lose their jobs when Ofsted come in and say that the services are inadequate. And I just think it's such a complex job, and it's so difficult. And it doesn't, it's not just a social worker that makes a decision to take a child into care or not. It's the police, it's health service, schools often have their eyes on children, and society at large, neighbours, etc., will see things or not see things. So I think it's just so easy to blame social workers, and it's the wrong thing to do. We all need to take part in protecting children.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm interested to ask the room a little bit as well. Sharon said at the beginning, that the death of a baby, a murder of a baby in these circumstances is the worst thing that there is, that there isn't a worse thing. And so we are talking about an event that is sort of beyond the pale. It's inconceivable. We can't countenance it at all, which affects, I think, our emotional response to it, obviously, and then arguably our critical faculties. You want to resolve it, you want to make it go away, and it's much easier to have a neat story than a complex story. And certainly, I reflected a little bit on Great Ormond Street, actually, as there's the police, there's Great Ormond Street, and there's the Haringey Children's Services. And Great Ormond Street is a sort of it's a brand that you want to feel good about. You want to feel that it's doing wonderful and incredible things, which it absolutely is. Yes. And also sometimes not managing to do the thing you want to do, which is, make everybody better. That's a more painful thing to give up than Haringey Children's Services was a bit it's a much more painful compromise. If I think about the Met Police, who are now, perhaps facing a shift in, we need to believe the police are there to protect us. We need to believe that functions as a thing, because otherwise, what you're going to say to your friend, your daughter, your mum, anybody, if you get into trouble, ring the police. I don't. We need to believe it works, but at the moment, I'm not sure we do believe it works, and that feels really a big thing to give up as a sort of, and I think that might be, I don't know what Patrick thinks, one of the reasons why there's been a reticence to really report on police misconduct. Is that fair, do you think, or am I reaching a bit?
I think it's you touched on a really interesting question here, which is about accountability and what accountability means. And I think with Baby P, you saw a perversion of accountability. Now, for me, as someone who's a citizen who pays my council tax and my taxes, I want to see good public services that operate efficiently and effectively and do their job well. And you want to see that happen. You want to see them provide the best service that they possibly can. And it's unrealistic to accept that everything is going to be perfect all the time. That doesn't mean that people shouldn't, staff members shouldn't lose their jobs or be punished or disciplined for what they did. I think what it means is having a bit more of a wider view of how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be in the future. And to me, that doesn't mean necessarily blame. And I think this idea of a hierarchy of blame, which is actually, if you're Great Ormond Street, you've got a lot of armor around you because everyone loves you and no one wants to see you fail. I don't think that's particularly helpful either.
Yeah.
And there was something that the judge said at Sharon's appeal, which I think really still rings true all these years on. He said, accountability is not synonymous with heads must roll.
Yeah.
And I think that there it felt like there was the first sober-minded intervention by a judge saying, calm down. Calm down, everyone. And I think that's what we always have to go back to. It may be that heads do have to roll, but it shouldn't be the default position. And it shouldn't be the point where a politician feels for performative reasons that heads must roll.
Yeah. Emily, thank you.
I have 3 points. I'll try and make
You
them
may have 3 points.
Sorry, as briefly as possible. Firstly, to your point about trusting the police, the thing I always feel about it is that there are obviously instances where I trust the police. The issue is I have no trust of that institution to report and to investigate its own failures. So an institution that is, more protective of itself and less open and accountable for what goes on in it, I've hard to find. And so it is, the second point is related, which is that its relationship with the media, I think, is one of the many reasons that it is protected. We've kind of skirted around it, but there are reasons why it's so protected. It's incredibly powerful, the things that have gone on, and it's completely hidden, and that hasn't been brought to light in any way that it should, particularly the type of media that and the type of publications that were so prevalent in the case, Sharon, most obvious being The Sun. The third point, I just, and forgive me, I may sound contradictory because I think I hold contradictory views, is that clearly this kind of heads must roll blame accountability is of no use. But I find myself equally angry sometimes at public institutions, including councils, where whether it's an institutional failing, a cultural failing, a process failing, terrible outcomes for residents. I was a local councillor briefly, and I felt this, but the thing is, I felt this from the inside. People would come to me and I found this wall of, bureaucracy is not the correct word, but an institutional, cultural, way of doing things that, whether it was just purely based on a risk management function where everyone was trying to pass off the ultimate blame because of the ridiculous blame culture where they knew their head would roll. And as angry as I am on your behalf about the way things are done, I am equally as angry on behalf of people who are being failed by these institutions. And this is not uniquely public institutions. Obviously it's private sector organizations too, where people are being failed. So I don't know. And so and then the third thing that makes me angry is that no one is then sorting out the actual underlying problems, which is the way that these institutions function. And the problem with the state, I find, is that if you are an individual who's being failed by it, it can be unbelievably difficult to fight for you against it. And that, by the way, includes the NHS. I mean, if you're, and it includes experiences. So how you marry up all these things, and forgive me, I have no magic solution, but I thought they were points that I found interesting.
It definitely feels like there's a sort of awkward inverse thing where the institution collectively fails or makes a mistake or whatever the thing is, and the way that we want to clean that up is by removing an individual at the top of it, but clearly doesn't tackle any of the issue underneath. And yet, as you say, if you were to encounter an individual social worker, let's say police person, you would be inclined, because they're a human being in front of you, to be more able to believe in them and to trust them and so forth. It's a sort of odd sort of inverse relationship between those two things. Does somebody over there have their hand up? Ellen?
I did, although I was listening so intently to Emily, I've slightly got tied up in my head now what I was going to say. Which I was just very struck by what Sharon said at the beginning about how understanding is kind of a precursor to forgiveness. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about tonight is actually trying to get to the bottom of what happened in this particular case. So it's not so much, that before we can be prepared to attribute forgiveness or blame, we have to understand some truth of what happened. And that surely if we're talking about what's more difficult now compared to the past, we're contesting and struggling over so many more fundamental truths in our, whatever, in our society, whatever we are, amongst whoever we are. So does that make getting to the point of forgiveness even more difficult? Because we have to go through that contest, not just in specific events, but in more fundamental ways about who we are as a society and who we are as individuals before we can think about forgiveness or blame.
What do you mean more fundamental way more about who we are as a society?
Because there's, the contest over what is true and what isn't.
I see,
We have that discussion so much more frequently, I feel, I don't know, now than we used to. And that must, perhaps that makes getting to forgiveness that a bit more challenging.
Because we have to decide what we do and don't now think is acceptable, and that might be different from before, and what we do now and don't count as true, which might be different from before as well. What do you think, Sharon, about that?
Gosh, there's all sorts of things going right in my head. I mean, one of the things that is in my head is the comparison with terrorism, which I've always felt. There was a really interesting comparison between what happens around social work and how we feel about when things go wrong with children, and compare that to what happens in terrorism. Yeah, they're very similar. So social workers will know a lot of kids. Yeah. So though in Haringey we would have known 1,000, there was about 200 and so that we would have been concerned about. And there was a top 10 that I monitored on my staff brought to me on a weekly basis, and Peter was not in the top 10. So we knew them. And then if you look at terrorism and you look at the London Bridge attack and you look at Manchester Arena, the security services will say, yeah, we knew the guy. He was on our books. We were watching him. The guy who was in Streatham, yeah, we were watching him. We knew who he was. But like social workers, yeah, we had Peter on our books. And it was often a case of a child died. Your first question is, do we know this child? Yeah, we know the child. Now that was a negative, not a positive, that we had filtered out that child. But what happens in the two cases is the social workers get destroyed. And I'll not go back through some of the things we've been talking about. But Cameron and Brown and Boris have, in different words, said, this will happen again. We're on high alert. It will happen again. Yeah. But back then, in terms of a death of a child, David Cameron in particular said, you know, this happened 3 decades ago. There was a little girl called Maria Caldwell, was murdered in a dreadful way 3 decades ago. And now we have another child. In actual fact, when I did the research, 2,000 children had died from familial homicide in that time. But yet they'll stand up on terrorism and say, we're on high alert, this will happen again. But we don't know the names of anyone in the security services. Yeah, they're never named. They're never challenged. We accept it. We accept it. Even though there are such huge atrocities, we accept it that they didn't intercept these guys. Yeah. But yet compare that to, you know, what happens to social workers. So there's a whole cultural issue, isn't there? Which maybe I'm not connecting to what you were saying, but you made me start to think about that.
It's interesting, Sharon. We have been toying with, and actually we're going to do, it isn't live yet, so it's still pulling the thing together, but back end of November, we're going to do a whole day. We're going to call it the policing inquiry, so that we can really try and get under the skin of police culture and figure out what do we really know, what do we not know, what questions have we not been asking, and things. It would give us an opportunity to think about the sort of relative status, is a funny word to use, but there does seem to be a difference between things like counterterrorism and knife crime relative to other forms of crime that don't seem to get the same kind of, I don't know, gravitas or weight or something like that. Nimo, have you got your hand up tentatively? Hiya.
Incredibly tentative.
Yeah, go for it. Come on.
I've just been listening to the conversation, and it's really struck me how similar it is to the story I did about Shukri Abdi in terms of like the way the narrative so very quickly formed. Yeah. And just very quickly, Shukri Abdi was also a child who drowned in really suspicious circumstances, and people made a narrative very quickly formed about what happened and why, and heads were basically like, it was like someone's head needs to roll for this, someone needs to be blamed. Yeah. And it really made me think about, and these weren't the same communities that perhaps were talking about the death of Peter Connolly in 2008. These were like working class black and brown communities in Manchester, who were very disillusioned by the police and who had real reasons to be incredibly suspicious about the ongoings of what happened. And they were gunning for someone's head to roll in a way that made them completely not care about the truth, or like, that's a really strong way to put it, but the truth became just an inconsequential part of the story as opposed to the larger campaign that was happening. And I think it made me think about, as a society generally, how we see justice and how we think about justice as being something that is punitive and harsh, and something that someone needs to be deeply punished for something that happened, as opposed to taking a step back and understanding how exactly we got to the point that we did in the first place. Yeah. And as a result, I don't think that there has been any resolution stopping what happened to Shukri happening again. And I think that perhaps something very similar happened in the case of Peter Connolly, where so many questions are still left unanswered because of the narrative that we got so caught up on in the beginning that seemed so easy.
Yes, I think that's the thing. Your outrage ends up being completely misdirected. The fact that we're sitting here now, and as you say, Sharon, we still don't know how Peter died. We still don't know the implications of all of those things. It seems extraordinary that that isn't the thing that we're all banging the table about, saying, well, this is outrageous. How can that possibly be? We've only got a few minutes to go. I feel like I'm echoing all of a sudden. So
Stop.
hello. I just wanted to touch on this notion of outrage, and we live in a world where, you know, it's easy to be outraged, because if you're cross at something over there, I joked about it slightly earlier on, it means that we don't look at me doing this kind of thing. And I wonder if people feel that, although in this case, that deflective outrage was a deliberate, I choose to believe, an orchestrated and quite sophisticated system that involved police briefings and phone calls between Rebecca Brooks and Ed Balls and all those things that were happening to create a sort of deflected outrage. But all the time in the world of Twitter, that outrage happens, you know, every tweet. You know, somebody says something and suddenly we can all be cross with them. And that really buys us some time. And I just wonder if that is something that you think is, on a micro level, on an individual basis, sort of, you know, helicoptering up to be something that is now part of our muscle memory of this is just how institutions do work, because we've sort of learnt it in a small way. I can see people nodding. Seb, do you want to? Oh yes, Steph, go on.
Thank you. Well, I think it's really interesting as well that, so I heard a really great quote, I think it was a Malcolm Gladwell quote, and it said that exclusion isn't punishment, it's cruelty. And I think that that's kind of a little bit of what we see nowadays, is this outrage, and you get that immediate kind of visceral response. And you don't want to hear the sort of rational, reasonable, oh, it's complicated. You want to go for somebody, and you want to express that anger. And it's the same way that I'm feeling right now towards the police with the whole Sarah Everard. But once you move past that, and I think that's the really difficult thing, in the same way that you might have like a spat with a sibling or something like that, once you get past that anger, you can then go back and actually have a conversation that says, oh, well, you know, what really happened here? And I think we need to get, as a society, we need to allow the police and institutions to come forward and say, yeah, we really messed up. How can we be better? Help us be better. And I think that I can't believe that these words are coming out of my mouth, but we need to sort of forgive the police and allow the police the opportunity to redeem themselves and to work with us. And I think that outrage is the quickest response, but not necessarily the most helpful one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I feel like we could keep going. It's weird to say I've enjoyed the conversation. I don't know if I've exactly enjoyed it, but it's been a good conversation. And I want to say a big thank you to everybody who's contributed here, obviously to Patrick and to Sharon, particularly to Ray and to Sharon and to Lucy and the people who have joined in. A couple of things before we go. The first thing is to say that somebody who couldn't be with us tonight is Polly Curtis, who used to be editor here at Tortoise, and who, when she was here, did a really big piece of reporting on family separation. Sharon was interviewed for it, and it's going to be turned into a book that is coming out in the early part of next year, started from all the reporting that she did here at Tortoise. And it really does get under the skin of this thing about the status of social work and the nature of the dynamic between the people that they work with and the sort of funding that they have. I know we haven't been able to talk about. And I sort of feel that that's a good, you know, I'm thrilled for Polly, but it's a great thing for Tortoise that, you know, we were able to properly lean into the complexity of it, because there isn't a money shot in the story. It is just a system that you have to sort of unravel, and she did a fantastic job of it. And then the second thing is to say that, you know, in our stated mission at Tortoise, it says, written on the website, as a newsroom, we believe in responsibility, we care about dignity. And I think the way that the media in particular operated in this particular scenario, and continues to do in other scenarios, is the opposite of responsibility and dignified. And I think for us, it's a good watch out when we are tempted, which we sometimes are, to lean into the easy story, the quick response. I think it's a good thing to remember some of the principles that we've talked about today, because the truth takes time. Luckily, we're a slow newsroom, so we're allowed to take our time. The truth takes time, and even when we want to make the horrible thing go away as fast as possible, it just is never that simple. So thank you very, very much to everybody for joining us this evening. I'm going to go home with a lot of things to think about. I hope you will too. Please do join us again. Tomorrow is our Responsible Business Summit, where we'll be trying to hold business leaders to account to see if they are bothering to clean up the climate or not. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.